Warning: what you are about to hear tonight contains disturbing material. This episode is based on true events that took place in 1922 and includes descriptions of extreme violence, including the harming and death of children. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Good evening, friends. You've tuned in once again to In the Crease, where we deep dive into the eerie, the unexplained, the cold corners of history that refuse to give up their dead. And tonight we are going to go to a very lonely place. Far from the roaring cities and war-torn capitals of 1920s Europe, nestled deep within the fields and forests of Bavaria, there sat a farmstead known simply as Hinterkaifeck. Hinter meaning behind, and Kaifeck meaning the tiny nearby village it sat hidden from, as it was deliberately tucked away from the light. Isolated, forgotten, vulnerable. It was a simple farm. One house, one barn, a few outbuildings surrounded by dense trees and open fields. No close neighbors, no busy roads. To reach it, you had to walk half a mile of rough track. To call for help from there, well, you'd need the strongest set of lungs and probably a bit of luck as well. And in March of 1922, something inside Hinterkaifeck turned very, very wrong. Let's meet the occupants of the farm. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, the patriarch. Known in the village as the cantankerous, violent, and domineering person, he was a kind of man who could ruin a Sunday just by walking into a room. Rumors swirled around him like flies around an outhouse. And some of those rumors, well, as we'll find out, had teeth. Galizia Gruber, 72, his long-suffering wife. Tough, no nonsense, but cowed by decades under Andreas' thumb. Victoria Gabriel, their 35-year-old daughter, widowed during the Great War. She had returned to Hinterkaifeck with her children, trapped once again under her father's roof and his iron hand. Little Kazilia, Victoria's daughter, 7. Cheerful, lively, and beloved by her school teachers for her sweet voice in the church choir. Joseph, just 2 years old. The official story was he was Victoria's son, but whose son he truly was is a shadow we'll also delve into. And Maria Baumgartner, 44-year-old, a newly hired maid who came to the farm on March 31st, her first day of work. And it would end up being her last day of life. 6 souls, 3 generations under one roof, tied together by blood, secrets, and now fate. Hinterkaifeck in 1922 wasn't just isolated by geography, it was isolated by reputation. The Grubers were not loved by the villagers of Gover and Kaifeck. Andreas especially was a pariah. There were whispers of violence in the home, of incestuous abuse between him and his daughter Victoria. Whispers backed by disturbing court records from 1915, when both father and daughter were convicted of incest. Andreas served a short prison sentence and Victoria served a longer one, and when they returned to Hinterkaifeck, the shutters closed a little tighter. Neighbors would rarely visit. Trade deliveries were left at the gate. Children were told not to go near the farm. And yet, in their isolation, life on the farm continued. The cows, well, they needed milking. The pigs, they needed feeding. And the fields, well, they needed tilling. It was the rhythms of farm life, brutal, endless, masked, kind of the rot underneath, at least until the winter of 1921, when the strange happenings all began. The first sign came in the form of footprints. In the deep snows of February, Andreas discovered tracks leading from the edge of the woods straight up to the back door of the farmhouse. Not necessarily unusual in itself, Except there were no tracks leading away, just a single set of prints appearing out of the forest and stopping at the door. Then inside the house, things went missing: keys, small tools, bits of food. A copy of a Munich newspaper appeared on the doorstep one morning, and nobody on the farm subscribed to the Munich papers. Andreas would accuse the postman. The postman, of course, denied it. At night, the family began hearing footsteps above them in the attic. Heavy, deliberate steps pacing back and forth across the beams, as if someone was trapped up there or living up there. Andreas, practical to the point of absurdity, grabbed a lantern one night and climbed the rickety ladder to the attic himself. He found nothing. No sleeping bag, no vagrant, no raccoon plotting a hostile takeover. Just the dark and the smell of dust. He dismissed it, at least outwardly, but privately he started locking the doors more carefully, bolting windows he never would bolt before, and carrying his scythe when checking the livestock after dark. Old habits die hard, so do old men. But Andreas didn't know that yet. March 31st, 1922, a Friday. The sky over Bavaria was probably a bruised purple, clouds sagging low over the fields. Spring was making a valiant attempt to break through, but the air still carried a knife's edge of winter chill. In the morning, Maria Baumgartner arrived. She had been hired only a few days before, after the previous maid quit, citing, and I quote, paranormal disturbances. Now, Maria, who walked with a limp and was considered slow-witted by some, was met at the front door by little Cecilia and Victoria. She settled her things upstairs and began her first day's work, cleaning, feeding the animals, preparing supper. The day would pass quietly. Dinner was eaten. Joseph was tucked away into his crib. They probably prayed, maybe even sang. Maybe they listened to the wind moan against the rafters and told themselves it was nothing. Somewhere after nightfall, something lured Andreas out of the barn, or out to the barn. Maybe it was a noise, a strange scraping, a rustling among the animals. Maybe, just maybe, it was deliberate. Maybe it was a trap. What we know is Andreas Gruber left the house and entered the barn. And one by one, the rest of the adults followed. Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia. Maybe they heard Andreas call for help. Maybe they too went to check on a sound. Maybe they just moved through the motions of farm life, stepping into the barn like countless nights before. None of them came back out alive. Inside the barn, in that cold, dark, hay-strewn space, the killer waited, with a mattock in hand, which is a heavy pickaxe-like tool. Someone was lying in wait. And as each family member entered the barn, they were struck down, fast, brutally, with a force meant to kill instantly. Blow to the skull, collapse into the hay. Wait. Next one. Blow to the skull, collapse into the hay, and so on, so on. The slaughter was very methodical, almost mechanical. When it was done, the killer dragged their bodies into the corner of the barn, stacking them like firewood, and covered them with hay. The killer then turned toward the house. Inside, two remained. Maria, the maid, likely already in bed or getting ready for it, and Joseph, asleep in his cot. They didn't stand a chance. Maria was bludgeoned in her bedroom so fiercely that her face was described as split open by the coroner. Little Joseph was murdered in his crib, a blow to the head with the same blood-stained mattock. And then, and then the killer did something more unsettling. They stayed. They stayed in the house, tending the animals, keeping the fire stoked, eating the food for days. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The cattle were still fed. The little watchdog was heard barking, frantic at first and then quieter and quieter. From March 31st until the bodies were discovered on April 4th, the killer lived among the dead. Imagine that. Imagine walking through your house, stepping over the bodies of people you murdered, ladling stew into a bowl, then going out, milk the cows, chopping some wood for the fireplace, just, to keep up appearance, like it was just another normal Sunday on the farm. Now, Laura and special guest Aggie over at Front Porch Forensics' first episode called it the most chilling part of the case. Not just the murders themselves, but the coldness afterward. And they're right. Anyone can kill in rage. It takes a special breed of monster to stay after and live there. And so the farm at Hinterkaifeck stood silent until the gray skies, windows shuttered, chimney smoking, animals being fed. But the children were missing school. Wire seats were now empty. Mail left undelivered. Then the villagers start to notice. But no one went up that path, not yet. Not until it was far, far too late. When you approach the farm at Hinterkaifeck today, if you can find it, there's nothing left but a few scattered stones and a modest shrine. There's no house, no barn, and no walls to hold on to the memory of what happened there. But if you could step back in time in the morning of April 4th, 1922, you'd see a very different picture. The barn roof sagging under years of harsh winters. The muddy farm yard choked with half-melted snow. Smoke, though, was curling from the chimney like everything was fine. Maybe you would hear a cow, impatient for a milking. Maybe you'd hear the faint barking of the farm dog tied outside, whispering at strangers. It all looks normal, but nothing inside the house was normal anymore. 6 people were dead, and for 4 days, the killer or killers had kept the fires burning. Now let's rewind a little bit. In those 4 days after the murders, neighbors had started to notice things, weren't just quite right. The mail carriers found letters piling up. The local groceries boy dropping off an order at the gate noticed no one came out to pay. Church friends were surprised when little Kazelia missed school. The choir director noted Victoria missed Sunday Mass, which was unusual for her, even if her parents skipped it often. It wasn't immediate panic. This was, after all, rural Germany. People, they got sick, especially, this time of year. Or, maybe they got stubborn. But by Tuesday, April 4th, Lorenz Schlittenbauer decided something was off enough to warrant checking it out. Now, should be noted, Lorenz, he was a neighbor farmer. He was a former suitor to Victoria. He was possibly the biological father of Josef. Depending on who you asked, he was either a concerned citizen or a man with very complicated feelings about the family in general. He rounded up two friends, Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. Three men's, boots heavy in the muddy field, trudged up the winding track toward Hinterkaifeck. They called out. No answer. The dog barked wildly at them, straining against its rope. The barn door sagged open on its hinges, its mouth yawning wide. Lorenz led the way inside. In the dim, dusty barn, the sour stench hit them first. Rot, blood, the metallic bite of death. The hay underfoot shifted weirdly. It didn't feel right. And then they found it. A rough heap of limbs tangled under a mound of straw. 4 bodies. Andreas, Kazilia the elder, Victoria, and little Kazilia. Stacked like cordwood. Their skulls had been shattered, faces caved in, hands twisted up as if in defense. A split-second reflex against blows they never saw coming. Little Kazilia's face was torn. Her jaw was broken. She still clutched wads of her own hair in her hands, hair ripped from her scalp in terror. Whatever happened in the barn hadn't been a quick execution. It had been a slaughter. Now, Lorenz, to his credit, or eternal suspicion, didn't faint or vomit. He just kept moving. The 3 men crossed into the house. There, upstairs in their beds, they found 2 more bodies. Maria, the maid, still in her work clothes, smashed across the skull. Joseph, the 2-year-old toddler, killed in his crib with a heavy blow to the head. Both were covered. Maria with her bedclothes, Joseph with one of Victoria's dresses, as if the killer had paused just for a second to show some grotesque mockery of mercy. But there was no blood trail leading outside, no signs of hurried escape. Everything was terribly still. The police were called. Chief Inspector George Reingroover and his team arrived later that afternoon. And what they found only deepened the horror. Picture the scene, if you will. Basically, villagers wandering through the bloodstained barn like it's a Sunday picnic. Neighbors touching bodies, moving objects, even making a sandwich in the Groover's kitchen. Yet children possibly peeking through windows. And curious wives dragging their husbands to the murder house to gawk. There was more chaos than was needed. There was no crime scene tape, no secure perimeter. Just the old chief inspector standing in the mud, hands on hips, muttering to himself about how he's going to write the worst after-reaction report in the history of Bavaria. Any forensic evidence that might have existed was trampled, smudged, eaten, maybe even pocketed by nosy neighbors. Now, what little they could piece together was this. The killer likely lured the adult Groovers and Victoria one by one into the barn, striking each down individually. Then, after killing the adults, they returned to the house to dispatch Maria and Joseph. There were no defensive wounds indicating a struggle. The weapon, a mattock, essentially a farming pickaxe, was used with vicious, precise strikes aimed at the skulls. No valuables were really missing. In other words, it was not a robbery. It was not a random vagrant murder necessarily, or not a spur-of-the-moment rage killing. This was someone, the plan. Someone, for whatever reason, wanted these people dead, and then stuck around for days afterward to play Little House on the Prairie. The autopsy would confirm the worst. Andreas, face ripped apart, cheekbones exposed. Kazilia, the elder, 7 blunt force blows to the head, with the possibility of being strangled first. Victoria, 9 massive strikes, star-shaped fractures across her skull. Little Kazelia, face broken, neck mangled, hands clutched the hair that she ripped from her own head. Maria, crushed head wounds that was probably happening while she was sleeping. And the little baby, where he was lying, all caved in. But it gets worse. Court physician Johann Mueller noted that little Kazuya had not died immediately. She had suffered horribly before expiring. Once again, one of the best true crime podcasts out there, Front Porch Forensics, pointed out how truly terrifying this is. Laura would say this wasn't just a murder. This was a terror campaign inside the barn. And she's right. This wasn't just someone who wanted them dead. This was someone who wanted them broken. The chilling details don't stop there. The chimney showed signs of use days after their deaths. Animals, proof that they had been fed and even watered. And fresh cut wood was stacked by the door. Someone, presumably the killer, had moved into the farm afterward and played the role of caretaker. The full horror of Hinterkaifeck isn't just in the murders themselves. It's the slow, everyday normalcy that followed it. Cows still lowed, chickens still clucked, and the hearth still glowed. As 6 souls lay cold and broken under the hay upstairs and beneath dirty sheets. When Chief Inspector Reingruber finally filed his initial report, it read almost like a confession of defeat. No clear suspects, no fingerprints, no motive, no witness. And the clock was ticking. Evidence was deteriorating. Memories became a blur. And unfortunately, suspicions would multiply. The investigators could feel it slipping away between their fingers. Already, the local tongues were wagging. Maybe, just maybe, Lorenz did it. Maybe it was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, returned from the dead. Maybe it was just a wandering madman. Perhaps scariest of all, maybe it was someone still living among them. Because let's face it, Andreas Gruber had made a crap ton of enemies. But if you thought anyone hated him enough to murder him and his whole family and their maid, and then linger to milk his cows afterwards, it's kind of crazy to think about. As we head into our intermission to catch our breath, maybe grab another drink, it gets weirder because the shadows only grow thicker.
Wind carves my name in the frost again. The barn door breathes like lungs of wood. 6 footsteps echo, soft and gone. No stars tonight, no gods to look. Silent wishing silence take me home. One breath left to hide the song. The sky stood still, but the frost still forms around my tread. The house is quiet, but never empty. You buried the bodies, but not the dread.
And welcome back. So far, we walked through the cold fog of Hinterkaifeck's last days. We've seen the footprints, the attic footsteps, the terrible methodical killings. We've stood at the edge of the barn door and stared down at the ghastly pile under the hay. Now it's time to ask the question every detective, every neighbor, every historian has asked for more than a century. Who the hell did this? And why? Because one thing is clear, whoever butchered the Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner, it just wasn't some rando passing through the woods. This was someone with intent. Someone who knew the farm, knew the people. And perhaps even more scarily, someone who wasn't in a hurry. And someone whose footprints led to the farm, but never led away. So let's do what we do. Let's start where every good investigator begins. Let's go to the people closest to the victims. Because as any veteran detective will tell you, most murders aren't committed by strangers. They're usually committed by people you know. Often people you trust. People who smile at you over a cup of coffee while plotting your demise. And here, my friends, we have a short, but I think juicy suspect list. Suspect number 1. Lorenz. Oh yeah, you knew he was going to be number 1 on the list. He was, after all, the Gruber's neighbor. He owned a farm about 350 meters from Hinterkaifeck. And more importantly, he led a, how should we put this, a very complicated relationship with Victoria. For you see, after her husband Carl died in World War I, Victoria struck up a relationship with Lorenz. They even had talked marriage. Maybe they even had planned it. Some say Lorenz agreed to recognize little Joseph as his own. But Andreas Gruber, being that delightful ray of sunshine that he always was, objected. And probably not just in a, really don't kind of approve of this kind of way. More like, I'll frickin' destroy your life, Italian mob kind of way. There were actually lawsuits, property disputes, angry letters. And depending on which gossip you listen to, Andreas may have even blackmailed Lorenz over the paternity issue. Now, I know those aren't really necessarily facts of the murder, so let's fast forward to the murders themselves. When Lorenz and his buddy showed up at Hinterkaifeck on April 4th, Lorenz did the following. Went straight into the house without hesitation, unlocked the front door despite no one giving him a key, and found the bodies with what witnesses later described as an unnatural calm. In fact, some of the villagers said Lorenz was so comfortable at the scene, It was almost like he already knew what he would find. He even released the farm animals, fed the cattle, petted the family dog, all before calling the authorities. I'm sorry, if that doesn't raise at least a little red flag to you, then you are way, way more trusting than I am. But here's the thing. Investigators grilled Lorenz thoroughly. He explained that he had a spare key because of his past relationship with Victoria. He said he went to the house looking for Yosef, hoping the boy might have survived. He said his calm demeanor was just shock. They couldn't prove anything otherwise. There were no blood on his clothes. No clear motive they could really hang over his head that would justify wiping out the entire family. Call him suspicious? Absolutely. Convictable? No. In fact, Lorenz would later sue people for accusing him of the crime and would win. For the courts ruled there was no evidence tying him to the murders. Still, if you asked any true crime fans out there today, most still point to him as suspect number one. But maybe he didn't act alone. Maybe he had snapped after years of resentment and frustration. Maybe he came to the farm to confront Victoria and things, well, maybe they just spiraled horribly out of control. Or maybe, just maybe, he knew something darker was at play and his odd behavior was survival instinct. In a crime this twisted, nothing simple. So who could be suspect number two? A name we've only touched on a little bit. Carl Gabriel. I know, you're probably asking, who? Just Victoria's dead husband. The man officially was recorded as dead in World War I, killed by a shell blast in December 1914. Except no body was ever recovered. There was no battlefield grave, just a telegram and a cross next to his name in a ledger. Now imagine you're Victoria. You're basically raising two kids alone on a miserable farm with your abusive father. You start seeing another man and, well, maybe having a baby with him. And then one night, the husband you thought dead walks out of the shadows. Now, admittedly, it sounds like a bad soap opera, but people at the time legitimately wondered. After all, there were rumors. German POWs captured by the Russians said they met a Carl Gabriel who bragged about killing his unfaithful wife upon returning home. Some thought Carl survived the war, found out about Victoria's sin, and took brutal revenge. And of course, others have thrown out ideas like maybe he was too ashamed to come home after losing everything and decided to start fresh as, a killer. Now, what really gets a little bit of the soap opera feel even more so is when you realize Victoria had tried to declare him dead before she had Joseph baptized. And this made it a little complicated because church law at the time basically said no corpse, no closure. Now, the problem with this one, of course, is most modern historians do think Carl did actually die in the war. Other soldiers remember him getting blown apart. There was no secret survival, no bloody homecoming. And still, in a case with no easy answers, you can't even possibly rule out a dead man remaining as a suspect, as weird as it may sound. Suspect 3A and 3B, the Gump brothers. Anton and Adolf Gump. Now, I know, there's a name that just screams nothing good ever happens here. Now, according to their sister, Crescentia Meyer, the Gumps were involved in the Hinterkaifeck murders. On her deathbed, she claimed Adolf had confessed to her that he and Anton committed the killings. In the 1950s, police took her statements seriously enough to reopen parts of the case. They even arrested Anton. But they had no evidence. They had no physical proof, no witnesses, no forensic trial. The sister's story was basically all hearsay. And come to find out, Anton apparently had a solid alibi for the night of the murders. So we kind of have maybe another theory kind of collapsing into the farm mud here. Then we have a fourth possible suspect. A stranger. Maybe it wasn't anyone local. Maybe it wasn't personal. Now, some have theorized the killer was a wandering vagrant, a homeless drifter who camped out in the attic until he could strike. They point to the attic footsteps, the missing key, the fact that nothing was stolen except food. There's a problem with this theory. Whoever killed the Grubers knew their habits, knew when to strike, and knew the farm layout. A stranger squatting in the attic wouldn't know that Andreas Gruber always checked the barn last thing before bed, or that the dog was tied outside instead of inside, or that the family trusted the creak of the barn door enough to investigate without fear. Now, if it was a stranger, it was a stranger who had studied them for a fair bit of time, and frankly, that kind of feels even worse. And we have some other wild theories to throw out here. Some whispered that there were cult killing, that maybe it was a ritualistic murder. Andreas rumored sins bringing down some wrath of a secret sect, but no signs of a ritual were ever found. There's even one wild theory out there that says it was a serial killer. Bill James, in his book, The Man from the Train, suggested that the same person responsible for a string of American axe murders, one Paul Mueller, fled to Germany and committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. Though the motive was unknown, the operation to kill him was axe murders of families, and the timing does actually sort of line up and make sense. But let's face it, that likelihood is probably the lowest of all of these in the theories. But the truth is, no one theory completely ties up every loose end. If it was Lorenz, why kill the whole family and not just Joseph and Victoria? If it was Carl, why leave the money untouched? If it was the strangers, why tend the animals and light fires afterwards? Hinterkaifeck sits at the uncomfortable intersection of too much evidence and not enough. We have just enough blood, just enough motives, just enough madness, but never really enough proof. And that is probably why it haunts us today, because the killer, whoever they were, got away. They might have just walked back through those fields, disappeared into another life. Maybe they even lived in the same village afterward, nodding politely at all the people passing them by. They just became part of the story, and not as the villain, not even as necessarily the primary suspect, but just as another name in the long list of those who knew something, but said nothing. So here we are, the dust having finally settled over Hinterkaifeck, Bavaria, was left with nothing but questions. The farmhouse and barn, soaked with blood, thick with a heavy stink of death, didn't stand long. Within a year of the murders, they were torn down by order of the court. Not renovated, not sold off, not blessed by priests in some grand attempt to drive out any evil, just destroyed. Wiped clean from the landscape, as if erasing the walls could somehow erase the memory. They burned it down in 1923. Planks, roof, foundation, gone. Even the well was filled in with rubble. But as we all know, memory doesn't burn as easily. Today, if you trek out to that lonely stretch of farmland behind Kaifek, you'll find nothing resembling a house or a home. The woods have inched and crept closer. The fields, though maybe a little rougher, look basically the same, maybe though a little broken. A small shrine marks the place, 6 stone crosses, weather-beaten and worn. They lean together like old conspirators. One for Andreas, one for Casella, one for Victoria, one for little Cazelia, one for Maria Baumgartner, and one for Joseph, the smallest grave of them all. Locals will sometimes leave flowers. Candles flicker there on misty evenings, but there are no tour buses, no signs, no gift shop. Just a heavy presence of something left unfinished. So what truly happened here? We've sifted through the facts as we know them, the eerie footprints, the attic noises, the strange newspaper on the doorstep, the systematic, almost surgical slaughter, the chilling days afterward with fires burning and animals fed by unseen hands. And we've chased the theories of Lorenz, the spurned lover or scapegoat, Carl as a ghost returned from the trenches, or just a sad memory twisted by grief, the Gump brothers who were whispered in confession but never proven, and a stranger hiding in the rafters like a phantom. No theories tie up into a perfect little bow. And maybe, just maybe, that is why Hinterkaifeck sticks with us. It's not just the brutality of the murders. It really is the sense that someone got away with it. Someone stepped through the falling snow. Someone stood in the barn with a mattock raised high. Someone watched the hearth fire crackle while 6 bodies were dead. And then someone simply walked away. And maybe they were never even suspected of having done it. Maybe they lived a quiet life, maybe a few miles down the road, attending church, marrying, raising children of their own. Or maybe they just vanished, swallowed by history like so many murders before and after. Now, Hinterkaifeck is different from most true crime stories. Most tales, well, let's face it, they have some sort of a solution. Probably a trial, a confession, a set of handcuffs clicking closed. Hinterkaifeck has none of that. It has footprints and blood, and a silence so loud it deafens across the decades. And then there's those little things that haunt the story. The newspaper nobody ordered, folded neatly on the porch. The unlocked attic hatch swinging open at midnight. The missing house key that never turned up. And why did the young girl, little Cazelia, tear out her own hair in horror? And once again, Laura and Aggie, on their episode of Front Porch Forensics, pointed out best when they said the following: these were ordinary people living ordinary lives until they weren't. And what haunts us most isn't just the death, it's the way life tried to go on afterwards in that house, even as death sat right beside it. And that's what gets under your skin. The idea that something kept living inside that house, sleeping in those beds, tending that fire, pretending everything was normal when it was anything but. And maybe this is why the story refuses to die. Hinterkaifeck reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it wears the muddy boots of a neighbor. Sometimes it's the old creaking sound above your head at night. Sometimes it's footprints that appear without warning and disappear into nothing. It reminds us that monsters aren't always shadows in the woods. Sometimes they're the person milking your cows while you sleep. The Grubers and Maria Baumgartner are gone, with no family left to carry their name. The farm destroyed, the story almost forgotten. And yet here we are 100 years later telling their story again, trying to keep their memory alive. Not because it's chilling, not just because it's unsolved, but because remembering them is probably the only justice they will ever get. In remembering them, we honor them. We refuse to let them vanish in the silence. So if you ever find yourself wandering through the Bavarian countryside, if you ever see a lone shrine leaning against a field of wheat, stop for a moment. Say a prayer, or a curse to the one who got away, or just a simple question whispered into the wind. Because somewhere out there in those quiet fields, the question still lingers. Who killed these 6 people and why? And until that answer comes, Hinterkaifeck remains a scar across the fabric of history. I am JEFF. This has been In the Crease, bringing you the stories where the shadows grow longest. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you drive safe, keep your doors locked, and remember, sometimes the real monsters are already inside the house. Good night, everyone.